friends, welcome back to Organic True Crime with Sydney Hopes, where I talk about true crime stories and general spooky stories. And for this month of October, I've been talking about more spooky stories, and today we'll be talking about a haunted hotel in Canada. So our story starts with Francis Rattenbury, who was born in October of 1867. And not much is really known about his early life until in 1885 he began his architectural career. And he started off by working at his uncle's firm, which was called Mawson and Mawson. And I'm pretty sure it was his mom's brother because I think her maiden name was Mawson, but I'm not 100% sure. It was his uncle. And then in 1892, Francis Rattenbury moved to Vancouver, and he put out an ad in the newspaper to announce his arrival to Vancouver as an architect. And he actually lied about his education and his training. He said that this famous architect had taught him, but it turns out that architect actually died when Francis was only 11. So he did not actually train him. And like I said, his career started at his uncle's firm. In 1893, Francis won a competition to design a parliament building. So he moved to Victoria to work on this project and plan the parliament building. And because of this, this project started a very successful architectural career for Francis. He designed a lot of government buildings. There were some houses and hotels, but mostly like court buildings and things like that. In 1898, Francis met and married Florence Eleanor Nunn, and the couple had two children, Francis Jr. and Mary. Now, World War I caused a very heavy strain on Francis's business and also on all of his investments at the time. So his family and most families at the time were put under very heavy financial strain, and this ended up causing a lot of issues in their personal life. In 1923, Francis Rattenbury left his wife Eleanor for a 27-year-old woman named Alma. Now, Alma, we're going to switch and talk about her for a second. Alma Wolf was born in 1897, and apparently her father left when she was very young and was not really in the picture. But Alma became a very talented musician. She was part of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra by the age of 17, and I know she played piano later in life, but I'm not sure what instrument she was playing at that time. I just know that she was part of the symphony orchestra. In 1914, Alma married Caledon Robert John Radcliffe Dalling. I'm going to call him Dalling. And the two were both very, very involved in the war effort, and they eventually moved to England to be of better service. In 1916, Dalling was killed in action, and after this, Alma continued to volunteer and help as much as she could in the war effort. And she actually ended up being wounded twice during the war and was awarded a military award from France. In 1918, Alma began dating Compton Pakenham. I'm really bad at names. I'm sorry. I always have to apologize for that. Anyway. And then in 1920, he left his wife, and Compton and Alma moved back to the U.S. to New York City, and he actually then wrote his wife a letter saying that he wanted a divorce. So in New York City, Compton worked as a teacher. He apparently lied about his education in order to get this job, which I guess was just easier to do back then. I don't know. Everyone's just getting away with that and building their career off of lies, but whatever. Compton was a teacher, and Alma was a piano teacher. In 1921, Alma and Compton got married, and they had a son named Christopher. And then the next year, Alma and Christopher left Compton, and they moved back to Canada, where Alma was originally from. And she continued to work as a piano teacher there, and she was actually writing music under a pen name at that time as well. And then in 1923, she met Francis Rattenbury, if you'll remember from before. And in 1925, she officially divorced Compton, and Francis officially divorced his wife Eleanor, and Francis and Alma got married. Now, because of this, Francis leaving his wife for a much younger woman, there was a lot of scandal. It was a whole to-do. People were not sure how they felt about that. And that did not do any favors for Francis's business, which was already kind of struggling. So the couple decided to move to England so that they could have a fresh start. In 1928, Francis and Alma had a son named John. And then after this, the couple became completely celibate, and they actually moved into different rooms on different floors of their home, and that was that for the rest of their marriage, which was very interesting to me. And after 6 years of that, in 1934, the couple hired a 17-year-old boy named George Stoner as their chauffeur / handyman, and he did move in to the home to be a live-in handyman / chauffeur. Now, around this time, the family was suffering from some financial issues. I guess their fresh restart in England didn't really work out as well as they had planned for Francis's business. So they were struggling a little bit, and also hitting an interesting time in their marriage. And when George turned 18, he began having an affair with Alma. Now, Francis did know that this was happening. He was aware of the affair, and he just let it go on. It apparently did not bother him. Now, at this point, there are some rumors and stories that are not quite facts. It's an older story, so it's kind of hard to say, and it's also just kind of what somebody says happened versus what somebody else says happened. So people say that at this point, Francis and Alma rekindled their marriage a bit, and Alma tried to break things off with George, who was known to go into fits of rage, and he apparently did not take it very well. But all of that, we don't know that that is actually true. What we do know for sure is that on March 24th of 1935, Francis Rattenbury fell asleep in his chair in his drawing room. And at some point that night, he is hit over the head multiple times with a hammer. Alma finds him this way, and she calls the local doctor to come to the house, and he also calls a surgeon to come with him. And they apparently had a really hard time properly examining Francis's body because Alma kept cutting in and was hovering around them the whole time. So at this point, they guessed that Francis had somehow fallen and hit his head on the grand piano, and then kind of stumbled around and passed out, I guess. The doctor eventually called an ambulance, and Francis was taken to the hospital. And at the hospital, his head was shaved, and they were able to more closely examine his wounds, and that is when they determined that there was foul play involved. Now, Francis did actually survive this attack, and he was eventually transferred to live in a nursing home because he was not in a very good condition afterwards. When everything happened on the day of, Alma was completely hysterical, and she was apparently just shouting nonsense and seemed to be intoxicated, and the local doctor did eventually have to sedate her in her home. But the next day, Alma went to police, and she told them that she was the one that had attacked her husband. Alma was arrested and charged with grievous bodily harm with intent to murder. And on March 28th of 1935, Francis Rattenbury passed away in the nursing home from his injuries. And on that day, George Stoner came forward and confessed and said that he was the one that had attacked Francis. Now, instead of charging the two for conspiracy to commit a murder together, they were each charged separately for murder, but they were tried together. It was very confusing. They were not being charged together. It was either one or the other murdered them, but they were at the same trial together. During the trial, it came out that George Stoner had apparently been struggling with a cocaine addiction and had also had a serious rage issue. And Alma says that she only ever confessed to try and protect her love. She was just trying to protect George. She didn't actually do anything. And after less than an hour of deliberation, the jury came back and decided that Alma was not guilty and that George was guilty and sentenced him to death. Not sure how I feel about that she's just not guilty at all and it was all just him. I don't know. Maybe it was. I don't know. I wasn't there. Because of George's death sentence on June 4th, 1935, Alma purchased a knife and she drove to the River Avon and she stabbed herself in the chest 6 times. And she left a note. I'm going to read a couple quotes from it. "If I only thought it would help Stoner, I would stay, but it has been pointed out too vividly that I cannot help him, and that is my death sentence. It must be easier to be hanged than to have to do the job oneself. One must be bold to do a thing like this. It is beautiful here, and I am alone. Thank God for peace at last." What she didn't know was going to happen was shortly after, George's sentence was actually overturned and he was sent to just sentenced to life in prison. And then 7 years after serving only 7 years of his sentence, he was released to instead fight in World War II. And he fought in the war and he survived. And in 1944, he got remarried and he had a daughter. And he ended up dying at the age of 83, out of prison, just living his life. Interesting. And, a little fun fact, Francis Rattenbury was buried in an unmarked grave until 2007 when he was finally given a headstone, which I'm really curious about. I don't understand because he had children and family and he was murdered and just, I don't know. I wonder why that is, why that just got looked over. I don't know. Interesting. So this brings us to the Fairmount Express, or the Empress Hotel at one point it was. And some people say that Francis Rattenbury's spirit returned to this hotel because it was his architectural masterpiece, and he returned to the hotel so that he could forever listen to people compliment his work. And apparently, pretty often, people are known to have seen a thin man with a mustache and a cane walking on the stairs, which actually, there's a set of stairs that has a portrait of Francis Rattenbury hung up in it, and people say that they see his spirit walking around on these stairs. And the hotel actually does claim to have several different ghosts living in it. So first off is Francis Rattenbury, which we just talked about, but now I'm going to give you short little stories about their other ghosts. The first being Lizzie McGrath, who was an Irish immigrant who worked in the hotel in 1909 as a maid. And at the time, it was very common for people of this kind of position to live on site. So she did live at the hotel on the 6th floor. And one night, she went out to the fire escape to say her prayers like she did every night. But apparently, the fire escape was being renovated and nobody told her. So it collapsed under her weight and she fell to her death. And nowadays, people say that they see her just going about her regular duties as a maid in the hotel. Another one, which I found very interesting, is the ghost of an elderly woman named Margaret, who was a guest sometime after World War II, and she died in her room of natural causes. But ever since then, weird things kept happening in that room. So when it came time to do renovations, they decided to build an elevator straight through that room. That room is now just an elevator shaft. And now people say that they see an elderly woman in her pajamas wandering around the hallways looking really lost. And when they offer to help her, she guides them to help her back to her room. She guides them to the elevator where she eventually vanishes. Spooky. And the last one is a ghost of a young girl, but I couldn't really find a whole lot of details about that one. Just people claim to see an apparition of a young girl in the hotel. Anyway, I thought that one was really interesting. Older story about an architect who came to a wrongly death and then decided to live out the rest of his eternal life listening to people compliment his masterpiece. Why not? Made me think of Michelangelo, you know? Anyway, let me know how you felt about this one. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks so much for joining me.